Well, greetings to you. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to join you today, and thank you for joining me. I want to start with the title of this talk. It's called Can Christian Colleges Lead in Racial Justice? Can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? Now, I could have chosen a simpler title, one that was more straightforward. I could have said, How can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? But to simply say, How can Christian colleges lead in racial justice, I think presumes too much. It presumes that number one, they can do racial justice, and number two, that they can actually be leaders in racial justice. However much I would like that to be true, I have seen too much. I have experienced too much simply to assume that Christian colleges can do racial justice and that they can lead in racial justice. And therefore, that title, How Christian Colleges Can Do or Lead in Racial Justice, just didn't sit well with me. Now, I know many of you assembled today are scholars, faculty members, administrators, and the like. But may I have your permission to approach this talk a little bit differently than typical? Now, if I hadn't mentioned that, you might not ever know. I don't expect you to be familiar with my public addresses, but as I prepared my remarks today, it felt very personal. It tapped into my own experiences. And so I've done a good bit of historical background, and you'll get that knowledge, that data. I've incorporated a bit of sociology, so you'll get that knowledge, that data. But if I'm honest, I was much more in my heart than in my head as I prepared these remarks. You see, I've been part of Christian churches, fellowships, parachurches, and yes, Christian schools for much of my life, and I know from a firsthand perspective how difficult it is to answer this question: can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? I can remember preaching at a PCA church, Presbyterian Church in America, a couple of years ago. I had been invited to give a sermon. And of course, knowing my background and my work, they invited me to talk on the topic of racial justice. I can't remember the exact passage, but I know it's a sermon I had delivered several times before. And having earned my M.Div and done all the studying, I thought I was doing my best to be faithful to the text. Well, afterwards, you know how it goes. The preacher lingers around, especially if it's a guest preacher. There's usually sort of a receiving line where people can introduce themselves, shake hands, exchange a few pleasantries, and move on. But if you have ever been a preacher, you also know that that's a time of great anxiety, because that's also the time when people who were dissatisfied with the message let you know about it. Either that or a day or two later via email. Well, in this particular instance, again, I'm a guest. It's an almost entirely white church of a couple hundred people. In this line, the previous person walks off and the next person walks up. And I'll never forget, his first words weren't hi, hello, anything like that. He said, throughout that entire message, you never preached the gospel. You never said Jesus was the answer to all our racial problems. Beyond just his words, I remember how he looked. He was red-faced and almost trembling mad. And he used his physical presence, I believe, to try to intimidate me. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, white hair, white, of course, and much taller than I. And in the United States, we have a pretty big bubble of personal space, just sort of the social convention. You don't get closer to a person unless you really know them well. Well, he burst that bubble of physical space and got right close to me, kind of towering over me, and had this angry, upset exchange. Let me know just how much he did not appreciate my message. Now, all of that's one thing. But what also sticks out to me is that the pastor, the white pastor who had invited me, was standing just a few feet away to my right. He was engaged in talking with someone else and was angled away from me, didn't even know this exchange was happening. And I remember that because I remember thinking and feeling, why aren't you here to help me? Why aren't you nearby to help in this situation? Why would you allow it to happen in the first place? And so I normally save some of the lessons till the end, but let me give a lesson or offer a lesson right up front. Never leave a speaker alone after their talk. I know some of you who have planned events like this and hosted, especially back in the before times when we could meet in person. You're saying, of course, you never leave a speaker alone. But two things. Number one, you would be amazed. You would be amazed at how many people don't know that. And I've experienced firsthand. And number two, when I say alone, particularly after a talk, I mean, you are within a couple of feet and you are focused on and paying attention to what the speaker is doing and with whom they're engaging. Because you know the people in your school, your classroom, your congregation who would be upset about a speaker's particular topic. And you can sort of head them off at the pass, run interference, all of those things. But it's a simple thing, but it means so much because when it does happen, I appreciate it. When it doesn't happen, well, bad things happen. That's not all. I can remember an instance when I was seeking ordination. I'm now ordained through my local congregation, but I was seeking ordination through a larger denomination. And when you do that, they have you do something called sit for examination. They have you sit for examination. And this was at a time in my life, I was just beginning my PhD studies. And so I had to move away from where I had been doing my church internship and doing the process of getting ordained. I was 3 hours away at this point. So, this person called me, and this is the person in charge of the examinations and making sure people pass through the process, et cetera. And we were talking about just my plans going forward. How would I like to handle it now that I was so far away? Did I want to continue? Did I want to do something else? And I told him, I think, as I'm starting this new graduate degree and program, it's probably best that I press pause on the ordination process. And the person on the line who was in charge of these examinations, he agreed. And he said, I'm glad you said that because it has come to my attention that there is a contingent of ordained pastors who, had you sat for these examinations, they test your theology and background, your testimony, your pastoral perspective. Really, they're just trying to see if you check all the boxes for their particular denomination. But this man who I was on the phone with said if I had sat for those examinations, there was a contingent of people who were going to pepper me with gotcha questions. They were going to attempt deliberately to trip me up, particularly on the topics of race, racism, and white supremacy. You see, they'd been following my work online and in writing and in speaking, and they did not like my approach to race, which is pretty common, unfortunately, among Christians. And they were going to make it as difficult for me as possible to get ordained. And again, what I remember about this is not just that contingent of people who maliciously wanted to question me. You can picture almost the scribes and the Pharisees coming to test Jesus, to catch him and discredit him all throughout the Gospels. That doesn't stand out to me so much as the fact that this man who was in charge of the examinations, as far as I know, didn't confront these men. Didn't say, wait, hold up. This is not how we do things. But instead simply felt a sense of relief that he probably wouldn't have to speak to them. Now, I can go on. I can talk about the 2015-16 presidential cycle and how I was no fan of the person who eventually became president for a myriad reasons. And when I voiced that in my own private correspondence, whether on Facebook or some other medium, people came after me. So one person even called one of my church elders because of a Facebook post and said they needed to sit me down and talk to me as a Christian, as a young Christian. I remember people doing video blogs of me as well as written blogs, dissecting my every word in order to paint me as, a theological liberal is at best or a heretic at worst. I remember the racist memes, these pictures with racist words on them being sent by Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts that had the word Christian in their profile. And amidst all of that, I remember the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And so while all of this was happening to me, I remember just sort of looking around and saying, where are the people who I thought were my allies? Where are the people who I thought were my friends? And they were silent, many of them. So here's another lesson. It's a bonus. You're getting bonus lessons just because I like you. Here's a bonus lesson. You may not be the articulator of racist words, nor may you be the perpetuator of racist deeds, but you are an enabler of those racist words and deeds if you stay silent in the midst of them. Shall I repeat? You may not be the articulator of racist words or the perpetuator of racist deeds, but you are an enabler of those racist words and deeds if you stay silent in the midst of them. And one more lesson as I close out this section and move to the next. I want you to understand, especially the white people among this group, I need you to understand that in preparing my remarks, I had to recall these incidents. I had to dredge up some of the most painful memories of my adult life, and I had to even relive them to an extent in order to communicate them to you. And so what you must understand is that this work of racial justice is costly, especially to Black people and people of color who experience its most pernicious effects day to day and on through the generations. And so bear that in mind as you invite speakers to come and talk about race. Bear that in mind as you ask students and faculty and staff to explain their experiences at your institution around race, and understand that as Black people and people of color, if we put on this confident demeanor, even if we seem very sure in what we say, understand that in explaining our experience to you, especially the racist ones, there's pain there. Sometimes there's even trauma there. But we do it for the sake of the body. We do it for the sake of the people in the organization. We do it for the sake of change for ourselves and for others. And so we're willing, we're able, but it's not easy. Somebody can say amen. I know we're on a virtual presentation, but we do have a comments section. And understand, if you are in a decision-making role, that people should be compensated appropriately for being called upon to speak and teach about their racial experiences and the risks they take in doing so. I could tell you about some pretty harrowing experiences beyond just conversation after talks that I've had. And this is especially true for women. But you should consider hazard pay for these kinds of talks. That can come in the form of additional financial compensation. I'm not talking about me, I'm doing fine, but you've been gracious to me. But I'm talking about in the form of additional financial compensation. I'm talking about provisions to receive mental health therapy. I'm talking about additional time off for vacation days. How can you go above and beyond in light of the difficulty of this topic and how hard it is for racial and ethnic minorities? Back to the title of this message. Can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? I want to break that question down into a couple smaller ones. Number one, can Christian colleges do racial justice? Can Christian colleges even do racial justice? And I'll tell you where that question comes from in a moment. And then number two, how can Christian colleges do racial justice? And understand beneath both of these questions is another one, not just can Christian colleges do racial justice, not just how Christian colleges can do racial justice, but can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? Can Christian colleges pave the way and be trailblazers and at the vanguard of racial justice in higher education and in our society as a whole? Now, I don't know if the chat function is turned on for the group, but if somebody would be so kind to drop some links as I name them, some website links. One preliminary is that this is part of an ongoing conversation. And there's not enough I can say in this conversation to really get us where we need to go. And in fact, there's never an end to the conversation. So in other words, if you want to continue the conversation, here are some ways you can do that. You can visit my newsletter. I just started that in December. And it is at the website jemartisby.substack.com. jemartisby.substack.com. You can also visit, I'm the CEO of The Witness, Inc., and we are in the midst of raising $500,000 for a Black-led Christian organization, our organization. We would love for you to find out more. Go to thewitnessinc.com, thewitnessinc.com. Also, I'm the host of a podcast called Pass the Mic, MIC. I'm a co-host of that. And then if you have not bought my most recent book, How to Fight Racism, How to Fight Racism. You can get $5 off on Amazon. Use the code 5JUSTICE, the number 5 and the word justice. 5JUSTICE for your coupon code or your discount code. You'll get $5 off that book. So go out and buy it. If you have not already, you can go to Amazon and use that code, or your local bookstore. So I would like to continue this conversation, and one last way to do that is via social media. You can see me on Instagram and Twitter at Jemar Tisby, at Jemar Tisby. Also search for my Facebook author page. Now, that's that. Let me continue with this. In a talk like this, where we're talking about can Christian colleges lead in racial justice, we're going to be using words like racism and white supremacy, but oftentimes we don't define those. And so I want to define them for the purposes of my talk. There are other ways to define them. Don't get mad at me. I'm just saying this is how I'm using it in this conversation. So understand this. Number one, racism is not just about your personal feelings towards someone else. Racism isn't just about your personal feelings. It's not just using the N-word. It's not just refusing to sit next to a person of a different race or ethnicity, something like that. Social psychologists often define racism this way: a system of advantage based on race. A system of advantage based on race. You can write that down. Or this one is even more shorthand: prejudice plus power. Prejudice plus power. Now, that word system is vital, because we live in a society that has been deliberately constructed over the course of hundreds of years and countless decisions, big and small, to offer advantages to white people and disadvantages to Black people and people of color. A society that has been deliberately constructed to offer advantages to white people and disadvantages to Black people and people of color. Now, beyond racism, there is the underlying idea that perpetuates racism. And that idea is white supremacy. I know that is not a pleasant phrase for many people to hear. It's not a pleasant ideology. But by white supremacy, one person calls it the narrative of racial difference, the narrative of racial difference. And I like that because it says that race is part of a story. And that white supremacy is the story that we tell about race and racial difference. The narrative of racial difference, or white supremacy, says that people of African descent have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, less of everything than white people. Other ways to explain white supremacy, or other terms to use, are white normativity, white centeredness, white hegemony. And of course, in between Black and white are all the various and beautiful shades of brown, all the different peoples of color, as they say. We're all caught up in this. You know, I always thought it was interesting in school, when I was going to seminary, all theology that we studied was just theology, until it was Black theology, or Latin American theology, or Asian theology, or whatever it might be. As soon as it wasn't derived from a European or white source, it had to be labeled. Because it wasn't European theology, it wasn't white theology, it wasn't Anglo theology or anything. It's just theology until it was a non-white people group. Just a subtle manifestation of how our society centers whiteness. White supremacy tells us that white is right, white is normal, standard, acceptable, and then by extension, all that is non-white or of color is wrong, it's exotic, it's substandard, it's inferior. The reason racism remains is because the ideology of white supremacy remains. Now, let's talk about this question. Can Christian colleges do racial justice? Can I give you a fire quote here? This is from Robert P. Jones. He is the president of the Public Religion Research Institute. He wrote his most recent book is White Too Long. White Too Long. And in that book, he says this: white Christians have not just been complacent. They have not only been complicit. Rather, as the dominant cultural power in America, they have been responsible for constructing and sustaining a project to protect white supremacy and resist Black equality. I like that for its forthrightness. I like that for its directness. He's not mincing any words here. Let me run it back for you. White Christians have not just been complacent, they have not only been complicit. As the dominant cultural power in America, they have been responsible for constructing and sustaining a project to protect white supremacy and resist Black equality. My. Let me talk about something here. If you haven't read the book by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, Divided by Faith, I highly recommend that to you. That's a resource you should write down. Divided by Faith. It's more than 20 years old at this point, but still very relevant. In that book, Emerson and Smith talk about the white evangelical toolkit. I mean, what they're doing is a sociological examination of why Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, as the saying goes. Why are our churches divided by race, especially along Black and white lines? And one of their theses is simply that, in fact, white evangelicals, the way they believe religion, the way they understand Christianity, actually perpetuates racial separation in spite of their professed desire for unity. And one of the ways they get there is to talk about the white evangelical cultural toolkit and how it affects their understanding of race and racism. So let me give you 3 components of that white evangelical toolkit. If you can't read it here, I'm going to say it. Number 1, accountable individualism. Number 2, relationalism. And number 3, implications. I'm sorry. That's number 3, anti-structuralism. Let me go through each of those. Accountable individualism is, quote, individuals exist independently of structures and institutions. They have free will and are individually accountable for their own actions. So individuals exist independently of structures and institutions. Relationalism, a strong emphasis on personal relationships. And then anti-structuralism, they believe that invoking social structures shifts guilt away from its root source, the accountable individual. Invoking social structures shifts guilt away from its root source, which is the individual. Now, what does all that mean in terms of this cultural and theological, really, toolkit? Well, accountable individualism means that what I believe because I've chosen to believe it, almost completely independent of the community and the society around me. Okay? And therefore, I am individually accountable for my own actions, and there's nothing that the broader community has to do with what I do. Socialists would argue with that. Relationalism, a strong emphasis on personal relationships. Okay, that's fine. Personal relationships are great. But when it comes to race and racism, If your emphasis is on personal relationships, then it goes back to what we said before, that you primarily understand racism as a problem of individual interpersonal attitudes. It's saying the N-word, it's not wanting to sit next to someone. But we know that racism and its manifestations go beyond the individual, go beyond personal attitudes. But this relationalism makes that hard for white evangelicals to see. And then anti-structuralism, invoking social structures, shifts guilt away from its root source, the individual. So white evangelicals will shy away from any structural explanations of inequality, particularly racial inequality. And so you can look at stats that show that white evangelicals believe more than any other subset of religious groups, that when it comes to poverty, individuals are responsible for their own situation. And it's due to things like laziness or lack of ambition or whatever it might be. Whereas other racial and religious groups attribute more responsibility to social factors, systemic issues, and not just the actions of the individual. And so white Christians in general, white evangelicals in particular, if you're working with this cultural toolkit, this theological toolkit, it's going to pull you toward hyper individualism, which is going to limit the scope of how you understand racism, particularly in its systemic and institutional manifestations. So let's go back to that question. Can Christian colleges do racial justice? Well, from a sociological perspective and even a psychological perspective and even a theological perspective, I think you can argue it's going to be hard without some changes. It's going to be very hard without at least, broadening the scope. Whether you have to do away with what you already got or not, you got to broaden the scope to include systemic and institutional factors when it comes to racism. Now, that's all kind of theory, right? Kind of heady, kind of in the clouds. Let me bring it down to reality. See, that's why I love history. History shows what you believe by what you do. There's some Bible verse around there like that, You can say it, but I know what you believe. Show me by what you do, right? And history shows us what people do. And let me talk about the challenge. I'm just going to give you 3 historical examples that have to do with Christian colleges and seminaries, because we're in this higher education setting. Let me tell you how this cultural toolkit, how these ideas of racism and white supremacy manifest in actual events. So you may recall in December 2018, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary issued a report on slavery and racism in the history of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Of course, SBTS is the flagship seminary, the oldest institution of the Southern Baptist Convention, which of course was founded in 1845 for the preservation of slavery. Now, there's a lot more to it than just that, and it's worse than it sounds, so you can feel free to ask me later, but suffice it to say, they are 2 peas in a pod, the seminary and the denomination. In this December 2018 report, which gave an institutional history of the seminary, there was an introductory letter from the president of the seminary, Al Mohler, that said this: the founding faculty of this school, all 4 of them, were deeply involved in slavery and deeply complicit in the defense of slavery. Many of their successors on this faculty throughout the period of Reconstruction and well into the 20th century advocated racial segregation, the inferiority of African Americans, and openly embraced the ideology of the lost cause. That's the report. Let me give you some key findings of this report. It was 72 pages long. As I mentioned before, all 4 seminary founders were slaveholders: James P. Boyce, John A. Brodess, Basil Manley Jr., and William Williams were all slaveholders. And that's important because if you have rotten roots, it's going to lead to bitter fruits. And that's what we see in the history of the seminary. This part struck me. Joseph E. Brown, the seminary's most important donor and chairman of its board of trustees, chairman of the board, from 1880 to 1894, he earned much of his fortune by the exploitation of mostly black convict lease laborers. So the report goes on to say that not only did Joseph E. Brown, who was the chairman of the board, earn much of his fortune by convict leasing, but that he actually helped to save the seminary when it was in financial straits through a huge donation, which was filthy lucre or ill-gotten gain, because it's coming from convict leasing. Now, I don't have to have time to go into the injustice of convict leasing. Suffice it to say that as a teaching assistant in my doctoral program, I taught at Parchman Farm. It's now known as Mississippi State Penitentiary, but it was Parchman Farm, founded in the early 1900s as essentially a slave plantation. And for this man, one of the founder, one of the leaders of the seminary, to have earned his fortune from convict leasing is appalling. That's not all. The seminary didn't fully desegregate till 1951. It did allow some black people to take classes. For instance, Gorland Offutt was the first black graduate back in 1941, but because of segregation, they wouldn't let him participate in graduation along with his classmates. And then they didn't fully desegregate their classes till 1951. In 1961, this might surprise you, they invited Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he accepted and he spoke there. Now, he was invited by some faculty. They were mostly liberal on that spectrum, right? And the students received him well. He spoke. They gave him a standing ovation. But here's what happened after. Taylor Branch, the historian, wrote this. He said, within the church, this simple invitation to King was a racial and theological heresy, such that churches across the South rescinded their regular donations to the seminary. You know what that means? They heard that Martin Luther King Jr. had come to speak at their denominational seminary, and they said, that man is liberal, he's Marxist, he's communist, we don't want him influencing our students, we withdraw our donations. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But for all of this accurate, honest history that the report states, it ended too soon. This is my critique. It ends in the 1960s, which gives the impression that all those racial problems ended in the 1960s. It says nothing about the 70s and onward, nor about ongoing issues of racial tension and racism at the seminary, even to this day. And I have, eyewitness, firsthand testimony from Black students and people of color who have been there. So it gives a wrong impression at the end of the day. Also, they undercut from the very beginning any idea that this racist history is going to require radical, aggressive action in the present. They undercut the idea of any sort of, aggressive action to curtail racism in the present. And this is how I know. In that introductory letter by Al Mohler, it says, in light of the burdens of history, some scholars hasten to remove names, announce plans, and declare moral superiority. This is not what I intend to do, nor do I believe that to be what the Southern Baptist Convention or our Board of Trustees would have us do. So in other words, he's declaring from the start, from before you read the first page of the actual report, that says they're not going to remove the names of these racist founders. They're not going to change the names of, an endowed chair or something like that, which to me communicates volumes. I'll share this tidbit with you. This is me as a PhD student at Southern Seminary. I was enrolled there for one semester before I switched programs for a variety of reasons. But I don't know what would have happened had I stayed there. This is back in 2015. Had I stayed there through the presidential election cycle, through 4 years of this presidency, through the Emmanuel 9 massacre, and the Unite the Right, and the cell phone videos of people, all the stuff that we've seen racially speaking, I can imagine it would have been difficult, not because of the name on the school or the denomination, but because of the stances of so many people in power toward race, and the hesitancy, I think, to do what might be required. Let me give you another brief example of why we have to ask this question: is can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? This comes from my first book, The Color of Compromise. And I just want to read you a couple of paragraphs. It's about a Black student named Dolphus Weary. I know the guy. He's in his probably early 70s at this point, and still lives in Mississippi. But this was his experience at a Christian college. Writer Edward Gilbrief relates the experience of a Black college student at a predominantly white school in the late 1960s who received the offer of a spot on the basketball team through the persistent efforts of an admissions director. The student, Dolphus Weary, a Black rural Mississippian, agreed to attend Los Angeles Baptist College, which is now known as the Masters University. Weary was one of the first 2 Black students at the school. And at first, it was a positive experience. He earned good grades, and he helped lead the basketball team to a 19-5 record that season. On April 4th, 1968, a white classmate ran up to Weary and asked whether he had heard the news about Dr. King. When Weary turned on the radio to get an update, he was, quote, devastated to hear that King had been shot. As he sat in his room, he could hear his white peers down the hall laughing. Then came the awful news that King was dead. As soon as commentators reported this news, the young Black man, quote, could hear white voices down the hall let out a cheer. Reflecting back on this experience, Weary said, laughing at Dr. King's death was just like laughing at me, or at the millions of other Blacks for whom King labored. Now, remarkably, Weary did not let the hate of other people consume him. He spent his life, and is spending his life, working for racial reconciliation in his home state of Mississippi. King gets assassinated. His white classmates are heard laughing down the hall. This is Dolphus Weary, back in his college days and closer to the present, still alive. This is not that long ago. And for those who think this is still too long ago, let me tell you about a university I just visited. And I share this not to call out this university, but because all of this is public, it's contemporary, lest you think these issues are simply a matter of the past, and because I think it's instructive, because a lot of these issues other Christian colleges are going through. So let me talk to you about Abilene Christian University. You remember George Floyd, right? Black man who was killed by a white police officer who was kneeling on his neck for a horrifying 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which led to George Floyd's death, but not before he uttered those chilling words that we've heard before: I can't breathe. George Floyd's murder, combined with the news of Breonna Taylor's murder, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, and several other events chronologically nearby, led to a historic string of protests and uprisings in support of racial justice in 2020. It was such a furor that many individuals and institutions that typically would not speak out did begin to speak out. And that's what happened at Abilene Christian University. The president, whose name is Dr. Phil Schubert, he released a statement, and it was in the newspaper, which is why I'm sharing this with you. It was just 4 paragraphs long, not very long. But one sentence is telling. It says, ACU doesn't typically comment on national issues. ACU doesn't typically comment on national issues. Now, from one perspective, you can understand that, of course. You know, it's a college or university. It's not necessarily your lane to comment on national topics, nor could you comment on everything that might need commenting. But I do think it's telling simply because this is going to strike people as unusual, that it would be unusual for this, in this case, university, to speak up, not just on a national event, but about race in general. Then when you dig into the, well, so the question is, to ask yourself, would it be surprising for your institution to speak to an incident of national racial tragedy? Would your people be ready for such an institutional statement, or would they be like, where's this coming from, because they haven't heard you speak out on it before? It's also telling, and what got Dr. Schubert in some hot water with Black people and people of color. He spoke in very general terms. And so he spoke in general terms about racial reconciliation and valuing diversity, but he didn't go into detail. And particularly, he didn't say the phrase Black Lives Matter. Now, however you feel about that phrase, the movement, the organization, whatever, the point is this: when you speak in what Dr. King calls pious irrelevancies and vain trivialities, people notice. People notice it's not coming from the heart. People notice it's timid. People notice that you're not being specific. And yeah, you can say all the right things about race and not being racist and all that. Pious irrelevancies, vain trivialities. Get to the point. Speak it, name it. Ruffle some feathers if you have to, for the sake of truth and for the sake of justice. It also points us to another lesson, that a lot of personnel at Christian colleges and institutions, especially at the administrative level, are so unpracticed, are so unfamiliar with talking about race, that they miss what to say. And they miss the mark at critical moments when words and actions of healing and trust building are vital. They can't nail it. And it tells us that many people, even if you know more, even if you can say the right things, you hold back because you don't want to risk the ire of alumni, of trustees, of donors. You don't want a 1961 Martin Luther King Southern Baptist Seminary situation going down where people are withdrawing their funding. And so the question, can Christian colleges do racial justice? There's a lot that's arrayed against you. I want to talk more about the arc of racial justice, which is from my book, How to Fight Racism, and it stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. It is a framework that I think you can use to develop a plan for your individual life, for your classroom, if you're a teacher, and for your institution. How are we working to build awareness year-round? How are we working to build cross-cultural, intentional relationships of equality, not just people being projects, across racial and ethnic lines? And how are we committing ourselves not just to the interpersonal aspect of race, fighting racism, but to the systemic and institutional aspects? Let me give you 3 brief suggestions along those lines, what you might do. To build awareness, I don't know if you've already done this, but do it if you haven't. Do an institutional history, a racial history. All right, not just the high points of what happened and who did it, when, the racial history of Gordon. Maybe you've done that. Then the question becomes, how do you disseminate it to everyone, students, alumni, trustees, etc.? And how do you keep refining it? And do, maybe you've done the written report, do a video, do a mini documentary, do interviews with original, historical actors that you've covered. Constantly refine and tweak it. For the commitment, let me jump to commitment, and then I'll come back to relationships. Cluster hiring. You've probably heard about cluster hiring. In my book, How to Fight Racism, I talk about how Emory University was able to very quickly increase the racial and ethnic diversity of its faculty, not by hiring just onesies and twosies here, not by just letting every department do their own thing and maybe happen to get a racial or ethnic minority, but by making a coordinated cross-departmental effort to bring in faculty of color all at the same time, which has tons of benefits, and we can get into that a little later. But the relationships aspect, let me tell you one more analogy. There's a difference between a light switch and a smoke detector. A light switch you can keep flipping on and off. A smoke detector always stays on. When it comes to racial justice, my concern is that many white people treat it like a light switch. That they flip it on when they're at work, that they flip it on when it's 2020s at 20 and it's constantly in the headlines, that they flip it on when a black person brings up a concern or whatever it might be. But as soon as it gets hard, as soon as it gets inconvenient, as soon as you get tired, you flip it off. Black people and people of color don't have that luxury. For us, we have to have a smoke detector on for racism. We have to be able to detect the smoke, because where there's smoke, there's fire, and we can get burned. And a smoke detector is only effective as long as it's on. And so relationally, you need to put yourself around people and in situations in a myriad ways that force you to keep that light switch on. Because the temptation is always going to be to pull it off in a white supremacist society. How can you keep the light switch of racial justice on? And to the last question, how can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? It's one word: courage. What I often say and what I'll mention tomorrow is that when it comes to racial justice and when it comes to leading in racial justice, we don't have a how-to problem. We have a want-to problem. And so often in the day of adversity, we have too many leaders, too many decision makers shrinking back and compromising with racism instead of courageously confronting it. So, can Christian colleges lead in racial justice? Yes, but it's going to take an immense amount of courage. Thank you.